We'll start off a little bit talking about some basic ruminant physiology. Won't go into too much detail, but I think it's important to get a little bit of background on what's going on in the rumen and also a little bit of nutritional background as we go into this topic. First of all, the rumen is just a giant fermentation vat. And so mature cow capacity of the rumen is going to be around 50 gallons. Holds a lot of water. And it's important to know that 70 to 90% of the diet is digested in the rumen, and that depends on what the animal is actually eating. But a great portion, and certainly the forage portion of the animal's diet, is digested in the rumen. What's going on there is microbial fermentation. There's microbes in the rumen that's breaking down the feed, especially the forage component, as well as protein and any grains that might be in a diet or other concentrates. And they're breaking those down into volatile fatty acids, or what we call VFAs. And that's really kind of the energy currency of a ruminant animal. Those are absorbed and the animal utilizes that for energy. The other thing is that's produced in the rumen is microbial protein. And that really amounts to the microbes being washed through the rumen and back into the rest of the digestive tract, and those microbes are broken down and utilized as a protein source. Also a really important source of protein for the animal, and we'll discuss a little bit later how that comes into play. In the rumen, there are microbes that digest mainly starch and those that digest mainly fiber. And this is important to understand when we're moving cattle from a high forage diet to a diet that contains more starch. We want to be careful as we do that and give the microbes in the rumen time to adjust. If they don't have enough time to adjust, you can actually cause some digestive upset in the cattle. So we'll cover most of these points in a little bit more detail, but the animal has basic nutritional needs of water, energy, protein. In the case of a ruminant, obviously they need roughage. There's needs for fats, minerals, and vitamins, and we'll cover a few of these things as we're going through. First, we'll talk about water. Oftentimes, water is easily overlooked and we take it for granted, but it's the most important nutrient in performance. It makes up 70% of the animal's weight. And requirements for water are really unrestricted access. And it's important to note that as feed intake drops with dropping water intake. Bottom line being that if there's no water, there'll be no water consumption, there will be no feed consumption. Animals will consume, a mature animal, around 12 gallons of water at a fairly neutral environmental conditions, around 70 degrees, but that can certainly double as it gets warmer. And the bottom line is, especially any cattle that we want to get good performance and health out of, which is really all of them, I guess. We want to make sure that they have all the water they want to drink. Quality is important. It's important to have clean water, and clean water improves intake. There's been a lot of research done on this area, and some of the things you might see in a practical environment. There'll be areas that have high saline water. You can have pH issues, either high or low. Oftentimes we see sulfur being high in water to the point where you can actually smell it. That can decrease water intake as well as cause problems and antagonisms with some trace mineral uptake. High in iron or nitrates. All of these things can decrease water intake, which will hurt performance on the cattle. So make sure that you know your water sources and how clean they are and what kind of issues you might have, so you can mitigate any problems with water. Energy. Most of the energy comes in the diet in terms of carbohydrates in the diet, and those can be either structural carbohydrates, which we'd see what makes up the plant cell wall or the fiber component of the plant, and that adds the structure to the plant and allows the plant to stand up. And then there are non-structural carbohydrates, which are really the contents inside the cells of the plant as well as grains. Things like starch, sugars, and even some fat in plants comes in the form of non-structural carbohydrates. Again, these are mainly digested in the rumen, as we talked about earlier, producing VFAs, microbial protein, and of course gas and heat. And so we're looking at an energy level in the diet. These are just general rules of thumb, and I'll give a few of those to you as we go through. Not meant to be set in stone, but just meant to give you an idea of the levels of energy and protein and so forth that should be in the diet. And we're looking at for a grower diet or a diet that you'd be weaning calves on, you're going to want to have between 45 and 55 megacalories per pound of net energy gain. And that should give your animals good healthy growth. So protein is made up of amino acid chains. And the sources of essential amino acids in the diet come from microbial protein or dietary protein. Now, microbial protein in and of itself isn't sufficient for the high performance we're looking for in the feedlot or even for lactating cows. And so we need to add a little bit of protein in terms of dietary protein. We're looking at either rumen digestible protein, and that just adds a higher level of protein. But in general, when we feed rumen digestible protein, the microbes in the rumen break it down, and you end up with a fairly similar amino acid component going onto the animal, onto the small intestine, where it is further broken down and absorbed. Or we can have protein that is actually bypasses rumen degradation and provides some essential amino acids directly to the small intestine. You can also feed what are known as protected amino acids, and these are specific amino acids that are protected from rumen degradation and are absorbed farther down the digestive tract. We mainly see this in dairy diets. There's not much research to support performance in beef cattle of feeding protective amino acids, but certainly in dairy diets we've seen that. So as far as sources of protein, we really break down into natural protein sources and then what would be known as non-protein nitrogen or NPN. Natural sources can come from a lot of different sources, and I just name a few here. It's certainly not an exhaustive list, but one of them that's really highly available in this part of the country is alfalfa hay. Alfalfa can be a good source of additional protein in the diet. You've got dry distillers grains or wet distillers, but mostly in the West, we're not close to a lot of ethanol plants, and so that product is dried down, known as DDG. There's soybean meal, canola meal, cottonseed meal, and many others that are good sources of natural protein. And then you've got your NPN, non-protein nitrogen, and really here we're talking about urea. It can be cheap, much cheaper than natural protein, and is very useful in small quantities. So under the direction of a nutritionist, you can get a nice mix of some natural protein along with some NPN to cheapen up the diet a little bit and really be an economical way to solve your protein issues. The nice thing about the NPN is it provides nitrogen directly to the rumen microbes. And so because those microbes are breaking down the feeds, they need that nitrogen. And then as they grow and proliferate, they produce more microbial protein that's available to the animal. In general, you're looking at a crude protein level in the ration of cattle in these grower or weaning type situations between 13 and 16% on a dry matter basis. Once again, these are ballpark numbers, but just to give you an idea of what kind of a protein you need to wean your calves on and having a grower diet, this is a pretty good rule of thumb. Okay, minerals. Boy, we could spend a lot of time talking about both the macro and trace minerals. I'm going to hit them lightly here. We've got salt, which all animals need, and it's really the only mineral that cattle will seek out. There's been a lot of research done seeing if cattle will actually seek out minerals that they need, and salt is really the only one. you're looking at between 0.2 and 0.3% of the diet dry matter if you're feeding a ration that's going to be totally mixed, or if you're providing salt through the feed. Otherwise, you could just make free salt available and let the cattle eat all that they want to eat. As far as calcium, calcium is pretty high in a lot of forages, but the more concentrate or grain you have in a diet, you may need to supplement some calcium. And again, ballpark number there would be about 0.5% in the diet. Phosphorus is fairly high in grains. In a grazing situation, you're going to need to add more phosphorus, but the more grain in the diet, probably the less phosphorus you need to add. Looking at around 0.2%, the diet dry matter being phosphorus, but it's important to remember that you want a calcium to phosphorus ratio of about 2 to 1, meaning about twice as much calcium as phosphorus. And having both of these in harmony with one another makes a big difference in cattle performance, and is something that you and your nutritionist need to make sure is in line. And I'm sure any nutritionist that you work with is going to know that. All right, and magnesium, usually pretty adequate in most forages, but when we're looking at feeding it in the diet, we'll just need to make sure if we're testing our forage that we've got adequate magnesium levels. Kind of a lower end NRC requirement for magnesium is around 0.1% of the diet dry matter. Potassium may also need to be supplemented with lower quality forages. Alfalfa typically has a lot of potassium, and likely you would not need to supplement potassium if you're feeding a lot of alfalfa, but you're going to want to look for it to be around 0.6% of the diet. Excess potassium, as you might see at times in really high quality alfalfa hay, can actually cause the cattle to get really loose. So it's something to be aware of both on the high and on the low end. Sulfur, really don't normally need to supplement sulfur, but I bring it up, and I mentioned it with the water, is that when it's in excess, it can negatively affect ruminal digestion and also the absorption of very critical trace minerals, both copper and zinc. So we want to be aware of that. Make sure you test your water, and then some feeds are fairly high in sulfur, like DDG, which is not in and of itself an issue. But if you couple that with high sulfur in the water and some other problems, you just want to be aware of your sulfur level and not get too high. Just quickly on some vitamins and trace minerals. And in general, these vitamins and trace minerals are usually deficient especially if you've got your cattle and you're providing all the feed for them, usually deficient and requires some sort of supplementation for optimal production. In general, these trace minerals I'll list for you are really critical in immune function and just overall health and for the growth of the animal. So trace minerals that we typically will be concerned about, and this is not an exclusive list. You could add to that, but generally we'll look at copper, iodine, manganese, selenium, and zinc. The levels I've listed here are in parts per million, and so you don't need a lot of them, but you do need to make sure that we've got levels at least as I'm showing here to cover all your trace mineral needs. There may be reason to feed some of these trace minerals are at a little higher level. Again, these are just numbers that are in the neighborhood of NRC required trace mineral levels. All right, if you're looking at the sources of these trace minerals, you can get copper sulfate or copper oxide and so forth. And generally, the sulfate forms are better absorbed than the oxide forms. So as you're talking to your feed company representative or whomever you might be working with on your nutrition program, you're going to want to look for the sulfate forms of these rather than the oxides. Another way to provide the trace minerals is through what's called an organic or chelated source. They're a fair amount more expensive, but they're actually attached in the case of copper or zinc or the others are attached to an organic molecule that is more easily absorbed by the animal, so your absorption can be higher. And this is especially critical when you know you've got some antagonisms going on say high sulfur or high iron in your water or other parts of your diet that might antagonize the absorption of some of these other trace minerals, particularly copper and zinc. And so, and then also when you've got animals in a higher stress condition, such as your weaning calves, that they can make a pretty big difference. And then just in general, vitamins, when you're looking at, say, a 550-pound calf, I've got some levels there. Vitamin A at about 25,000 IUs a day, vitamin D about 1,500, and vitamin E about 400 IUs per day. The requirement for vitamin E during normal production is probably closer to 100 or maybe even a little bit lower. But when we're looking at the stress of weaning and early in the growth period, when an animal is just getting acclimated to feed and coming and starting to grow, that higher level of vitamin E can be really helpful to the immune system. Okay, we'll switch gears a little bit and talk about dry matter intake. And this is a really important concept. Anytime when we're feeding cattle and we're responsible for how much they eat, it's important to understand how to look at dry matter intake. And we usually measure feed intake on a dry matter basis. The water content of feed doesn't carry any nutritional value. Now it does provide water, but there's no extra protein or whatever it might be in that extra water. So to give you an example of what I'm talking about, if a steer eats 34 pounds of corn silage as fed, and corn silage is looking at about 35% dry matter, then that 34 pounds times the 35% actually equals about 12 pounds of dry matter. So that same steer, if he eats 14 pounds of grass hay, and grass hay is in the neighborhood of 88% dry matter, we take the 14 times the 0.88, and we end up again about 12 pounds of dry matter. So a steer eating 34 pounds of silage or 14 pounds of grass hay is really eating the same amount of feed on a dry matter basis. So knowing the moisture content of your feed and calculating your intake and your ration on a dry matter basis is really critical. Another thing is to try to understand how much and predict how much you think your cattle are going to eat. So an example I used here is back to our 550-pound steer, and I got them eating about 2.2% of their body weight, and this will vary. They'll eat about 2.2, about 2% or so at first, and then their intake will actually increase over time. I like to figure out an average of about 2.5, but figuring their intake as a percentage of their body weight is a good way to look at it, because the more they eat, or the bigger they get, the more they're going to eat. So if we take this same steer eating 2.2% of their body weight, that's again back to 12 pounds of dry matter. So as we figure their ration and how much energy they need, how much protein they need, knowing how much they're going to eat is really critical in determining what their performance will be. So some of the factors affecting dry matter intake. We talked about body weight. The cattle will tend to eat about the same percentage of their body weight even as they get older. So even though an 800-pound steer is going to eat more than a 500-pound steer, both of them may be eating still in that 2.5% of body weight number. And so it's important, body weight obviously affects how much they're going to eat. The other one's cattle condition. Oftentimes you'll see thinner cattle that let's say they maybe have a larger framed animal that should weigh around 550 pounds, but they're not very fat. They're fairly thin, and they weigh 475. Well, if you look at that animal as a percentage of their body weight at 475, they're probably going to eat well over that 2.5% of body weight. And in fact, they may eat more like an animal would eat if they weighed 550. So again, when cattle are thinner, or green as the term is, they're likely to eat a little more feed. The other thing is energy level of the diet. So generally speaking, the higher energy the diet is, the lower the intake is going to be. And really, you can think about it somewhat like us people. If you eat nothing but candy bars, you're not going to eat as much of it in terms of pounds, because what starts to regulate your intake are the chemostatic effects, or your blood glucose level tells you to stop eating, as opposed to eating something, I don't know, eating salad maybe. You might get full before your blood glucose level tells you to stop eating. That's the same with cattle. If they're eating a real high forage diet, they're going to eat till they're physically full. If they're eating a high energy diet, they're going to eat until their blood glucose level gets high enough to tell them you've had enough. And so, generally speaking, the higher energy the diet, the lower the intake. The other thing is the environment. Heat definitely reduces dry matter intake. Cattle don't feel like eating. The ruminal digestive process actually produces a lot of heat itself, and so they will definitely back off intake when it gets hot. And generally speaking, when it's colder, cattle will eat more, but I've certainly seen situations when it's really cold and when you've got a lot of wind, the cattle will just bunch up and not eat at all. And this picture here is a good example of that. I took it in a feed yard in Kansas, and these cattle, we had a lot of snow, blowing snow come in, and then it got well below zero with a lot of wind. And we weren't getting cattle to eat in the yard because they were just bunching up trying to stay warm, and they didn't eat as much. So heat and cold both definitely affect the intake.